Hello, myth seekers. Ever wondered why Noah, after surviving a flood, decided to curse his son Ham? Or what cheeky deed Ham might have committed against dear old dad? And hold on to your togas, because things are about to get even spicier as we delve into the rather intimate relationship Lot shared with his daughters. But wait, there's more. Prepare to be blown away as we unravel how these biblical tales are not just kissing cousins with Mesopotamian myths, but might also be winking at the Greek gods, their spicy family dramas, and yes, even the snip-snip tale of Ouranos. So brace yourselves, because we're about to embark on a myth-busting journey of epic proportions, exposing the genealogic of these ancient stories. Let's dive in. Curse of Ham, family drama. In the book of Genesis, the curse of Ham is described as a curse which was imposed upon Ham's son, Canaan, by the patriarch Noah. It occurs in the context of Noah's drunkenness, and it is provoked by a shameful act which was perpetrated by Noah's son, Ham, who saw the nakedness of his father. The exact nature of Ham's transgression and the reason Noah cursed Canaan when Ham had sinned has been debated for over 2,000 years. The story's original purpose may have been to justify the biblical subjection of the Canaanites to the Israelites, but in later centuries the narrative was interpreted by some Christians, Muslims, and Jews as an explanation for black skin, as well as a justification for slavery of black people. Similarly, some in the Latter-day Saint movement used the curse of Ham to prevent the ordination of black men to its priesthood. Nevertheless, most Christians, Muslims, and Jews now disagree with such interpretations, because in the biblical text, Ham himself is not cursed, and race or skin color is never mentioned. While Genesis 9 never says that Ham was black, he became associated with black skin through folk etymology, deriving his name from a similar but actually unconnected word meaning dark or brown. This isn't the focus of today's episode, but it's worth noting for those still peddling this nonsense. Let's get past the ridiculous, racist nonsense of the past and move forward with better understanding. Genesis chapter 9, verses 20 to 27.
Noah began to be a man of the soil, and he planted a vineyard. He drank of the wine and became drunk and lay uncovered in his tent. And Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father and told his two brothers outside. Then Shem and Japheth took a garment, laid it on both their shoulders, and walked backwards and covered the nakedness of their father. Their faces were turned backward, and they did not see their father's nakedness. When Noah awoke from his wine and knew what his youngest son had done to him, he said, "Cursed be Canaan. A servant of servants shall he be to his brothers." He also said, "Blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem, and let Canaan be his servant. May God enlarge Japheth, and let him dwell in the tents of Shem, and let Canaan be his servant."
I just want to highlight how crazy it is that Canaan gets cursed for his father Ham's deeds. This really sounds like a horrific way of repaying justice for one man's wrongs, especially taking it out on your grandson because of what your son did to you. We should all see that this isn't something we should ever do to our own children. Agreed? Good. Now let's move on. The mystery of Ham's misdeed, and what did he do? Scholars have long puzzled over Ham's wrongdoing in the biblical narrative. They've narrowed it down to several interpretations. Voyeurism. Many believe Ham's act of seeing his father Noah naked wasn't grave enough to merit the harsh curse that followed. However, in Genesis 9:23, Shem and Japheth cover their father, suggesting they took the act of seeing someone's nakedness quite literally. Historical context supports this in some ways. In ancient Babylonia, looking at someone's private parts was a significant taboo. There's also a suggestion that Ham did more than just see. He may have spoken about his father's vulnerable state in public, leading to humiliation. Ancient texts like the Targum Onkelos and the Cave of Treasures imply that Ham's ridicule, not just his act of seeing, angered Noah. Paternal incest. Historically, some wondered if seeing someone's nakedness was a euphemism for a sexual act, as hinted in Leviticus 20, verse 17. This interpretation deepens with suggestions from ancient texts, like the Babylonian Talmud, proposing Ham might have physically harmed or even had a sexual encounter with Noah. Some Greek Bible translations and parallels drawn from Greek and Hittite myths support this theory. Maternal incest. A modern perspective, championed by scholars like Bergsma and Hahn, theorizes Ham had relations with his mother. Leviticus 20 verse 11 gives weight to this interpretation. The emphasis on Canaan's curse rather than Ham's could be seen as evidence that Canaan was the result of this forbidden relationship. In summary, while Ham's exact misdeed remains debated, scholars continue to explore and interpret its meaning, drawing from both ancient texts and modern insights. Violation of religious tradition. Devorah Demont highlights that the Book of Jubilees presents Noah's actions from planting to drinking wine in alignment with the Torah's guidelines. As a result, Noah's intoxication seems less concerning, and Ham's error becomes even more significant. Demont points out that the details of Noah's actions in Jubilees 7, 1 through 6 are consistent with specific interpretations from the Second Temple Judaism period regarding Leviticus 19, 23 through 25 and Numbers 29, 1 through 6. In this perspective, Ham's misdeed isn't just an act of disrespect toward his father, but also a breach of religious festival practices. Grave familial offense. The medieval scholar Rashi delves into the nature of Ham's transgression against Noah. He references varied rabbinic views. Some suggest Ham castrated Noah, while others believe Ham had a homosexual encounter with him. Rashi draws from the Sanhedrin 70a, emphasizing that those who think Ham was involved with his father sexually also agree with the castration theory. Rashi further contemplates Ham's motive. He suggests Ham reasoned that since the first man Adam had 2 sons and one killed the other over inheritance, Noah, with 3 sons, shouldn't desire a 4th due to potential conflicts. Interpretation of Ham's wrongdoing range from religious disrespect to severe familial offenses, reflecting diverse scholarly perspectives. In this episode, I'm going to give you a strong case for why the castration incest model makes the most sense. But first, I need to reveal some necessary information that might help us discover why this model makes the most sense. Let's go ahead with the biblical context and point out that in the book of Genesis, you have Noah and Lot suspiciously sharing some shocking elements that might help us before we see the Greek connections.
Genesis 19:23 through 38. By the time Lot reached Zoar, the sun had risen over the land. Then the Lord rained down burning sulfur on Sodom and Gomorrah from the Lord out of the heavens. Thus he overthrew those cities and the entire plain, destroying all those living in the cities and also the vegetation in the land. But Lot's wife looked back, and she became a pillar of salt. Early the next morning, Abraham got up and returned to the place where he had stood before the Lord. He looked down towards Sodom and Gomorrah, toward all the land of the plain, and he saw dense smoke rising from the land, like smoke from a furnace. So when God destroyed the cities of the plain, he remembered Abraham, and he brought Lot out of the catastrophe that overthrew the cities where Lot had lived, Lot and his daughters. Lot and his 2 daughters left Zoar and settled in the mountains, for he was afraid to stay in Zoar. He and his 2 daughters lived in a cave. One day the older daughter said to the younger, "Our father is old, and there is no man around here to give us children. as is the custom all over the earth. Let's get our father to drink wine and then sleep with him and preserve our family line through our father." That night, they got their father to drink wine, and the older daughter went in and slept with him. He was not aware of it when she lay down or when she got up. The next day, the older daughter said to the younger, "Last night I slept with my father. Let's get him to drink wine again tonight, and you go in and sleep with him, so we can preserve our family line through our father." So they got their father to drink wine that night also, and the younger daughter went in and slept with him. Again, he was not aware of it when she lay down or when she got up. So both of Lot's daughters became pregnant by their father. The older daughter had a son, and she named him Moab. He is the father of the Moabites of today. The younger daughter also had a son, and she named him Ben-Ami. He is the father of the Ammonites of today.
Here is a comparison between Genesis 9 with Noah and Genesis 19 with Lot. Noah had a world cataclysm by water. Lot had a world cataclysm by fire. Survivor of this cataclysm, Noah survives. Lot, survivor of this cataclysm. Noah, he drank wine and got drunk. Lot, he drank wine and got drunk. Noah, his offspring saw his nakedness, literally. Lot, his offspring saw his nakedness, literally, and in this case, it's explicitly sexual. Noah, he woke and knew what his youngest son did to him. Lot, he woke and did not know what his daughters did with him. Noah, national genealogies mentioned after this catastrophe from his seed, the Table of Nations. Lot, national genealogies mentioned after this catastrophe from his seed, concluding with Ammonites and Moabites, similar to the Table of Nations. We could go on to mention that whatever happened to Noah after Ham saw his nakedness had implications to his offspring. Whatever happened in Noah's tent, the result was not a pregnant person, as with Lot, his two daughters both get pregnant and birth the fathers of nations, similar to the Table of Nations list mentioned after this Jerry Springer scene earlier in Genesis. You can now see how just biblically one could see why a sexual deed makes the most sense just by comparison in the same book, Genesis. Strange detail to note, did Lot and his daughters really grab a bottle of wine before God nuked Sodom? Does this detail make any literal historical sense? Another strange detail by this author is trying to make Lot look innocent for having sex with his two daughters. A day or two earlier, Lot was offering his two virgin daughters to the raging mob that wanted to sexually take his angelic guests for a ride. Wouldn't Lot have questions of how his two daughters are now birthing two sons when they were virgins before they left and thought no one else was left on earth? If you think this is real history, you've been hoodwinked. It's time to wake up and ask real questions. Lot cannot remain completely innocent in this narrative. He needs to know something's up. Next, we will turn to the Greek world for answers, ignored by 99% of critical scholars. They either ignore it because they honestly have never seriously considered these comparisons due to their models of these portions of the Bible being older than this Greek connection. In a nutshell, most of the scholars are working off a model of comparing Genesis exclusively to Mesopotamian mythology using the documentary hypothesis. If something doesn't match the Mesopotamian world, they are quick to posit it as unique creation by the biblical author. The search for mythical antecedents stopped there. Why? Often it is because these academics prefer to stay with consensus on this issue. But Mythvision wants to explore all options. We are changing the understanding of the Bible for the world to see. Thanks to scholars who are pushing the boundaries, such as Thomas L. Thompson, Nils Peter Lemke, Russell Gamirkin, Philip Wajdenbaum, and several others willing to challenge the status quo. I hope that more people will see that we're even challenging those who hold to the documentary or supplementary hypothesis. That is our goal, is to stretch the boundaries and break free of the limitations on what we can explore, as long as there's sufficient and good reason to explore that path. Greek mythology describes various great floods throughout ancient history. Differing sources refer to the flood of Ouranos, the flood of Deucalion, and the flood of Dardanus, though often with similar or even contradictory details. Like most flood myths, these stories often involve themes of divine retribution, the savior of a culture hero, and the birth of a nation or nations. In addition to these floods, Greek mythology also says the world was periodically destroyed by fire, such as in the myth of Phaeton.
In Plato's Timaeus, there have been and there will be many and diverse destructions of mankind, of which the greatest are by fire and water, and lesser ones by countless other means. For in truth, the story that is told in your country as well as ours, how once upon a time Phaeton, son of Helios, yoked his father's chariot, and because he was unable to drive it along the course taken by his father, burned up all that was upon the earth, and himself perished by a thunderbolt. That story, as it is told, has the fashion of a legend, but the truth of it lies in the occurrence of a shifting of the bodies in the heavens which move around the earth, and the destruction of the things on the earth by fierce fire, which recur at long intervals. At such times all they that dwell on the mountains and in the high and dry places suffer destruction, more than those who dwell near to rivers and or the seas. And in our case, the Nile, our savior in other ways, saves us also at such times from this calamity by rising high. And when, on the other hand, the gods purge the earth with a flood of waters, all the herdsmen and shepherds that are in the mountains are saved, but those in the cities of your land are swept into the sea by the streams. Whereas in our country neither then nor at any other time does the water pour down over the fields from above. On the contrary, it all tends naturally to well up from below. Hence it is for these reasons that what is here preserved is reckoned to be most ancient. The truth being that in every place there is excessive heat or cold. To prevent it, there always exists some human stock, now more, now less in number. And if any event has occurred that is noble or great, in any way conspicuous, whether it be in your country or in ours or in some other place of which we know by report, all such events are recorded from of old and preserved here in our temples, whereas your people and the others are but newly equipped every time with letters, and all sorts are civilized states required. And when after the usual interval of years, like a plague, the flood from heaven comes sweeping down afresh upon your people, it leaves none of you but the unlettered and uncultured, so that you become young as ever, with no knowledge of all that happened in old times in this land or in your own.
I want you to notice that Plato, along with several of the other myths that have both water and fire destructions or cataclysms, world-shattering events that go by fire and water. He says those in the high places, they are in a good spot when it comes to floods because flood rises, and those who are near water see rivers. Mankind's always been next to these kind of bodies of water, which is why we have a common theme of flood myths. Not because there's some real historical universal flood that all of these stories stem from, but because that is how humans are. We tell stories. And if you live near water, water rises, floods happen, you're going to end up having stories about flood accounts. It's going to be built into the ritual and cultural fabric of your society. But in the Bible, notice you have a flood with Noah and you have a fire destruction with Lot, as we've already seen the comparisons between the two, with the sexual acts, with the getting drunk, with the generations and the national genealogies, the whole nine. There's no reason to not see these linked together, and there is no Mesopotamian myth that compares with these both fire and water destructions in them. Here is a summary of an extensive article written by Guy Darshan out of the University of Chicago, which is extremely relevant to this Genesis scene. Comparing Greek and biblical genealogies and flood narratives. Greek myths and the Bible both speak of a significant flood. While there are unique elements in the biblical stories, such as Noah's vineyard planting post-flood and a detailed lineage of his descendants, these are not present in Mesopotamian flood accounts. Instead, scholars believe these were quote-unquote original biblical additions because they aren't present in the Mesopotamian stories. But I ask, why not look to the Greek world? The Mesopotamian flood hero Utnapishtim, unlike Noah, does not live among people after the flood, but with the gods. Early Greek writings between the 7th to 5th centuries BCE show similarities to the biblical version. Upon discovering ancient Greek texts like the Catalogue of Women, scholars found closer parallels between Greek and biblical genealogies. Early 20th century researchers identified similarities between biblical genealogies and those in the Greek traditions. Specifically, Genesis 10 delineates how various nations descended from Noah's sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. This account describes how regions like Asia Minor, Egypt, Nubia, and the Syrian expanse had roots tracing back to these sons and thus to Noah. Another part of Genesis depicts the ancestry of regions like Babylonia, Egypt, Canaan, and the Arabian areas. This way of organizing world populations by lineage and region is unique to biblical literature, with no close parallels in the ancient Near Eastern texts. As Klaus Westermann contends, quote,
"The Table of Nations is unique and has no parallel either inside or outside the Old Testament."
But that isn't the case, according to Guy Darshan. The Greek genealogical traditions provide an interesting comparison. Just as the biblical Table of Nations traces nations back to Noah, the Greek accounts trace many Mediterranean nations back to figures from Argive myths, like Ouranos and his descendants. They include places like Egypt, Libya, Lycia, Crete, and Phoenicia in their genealogies. In both biblical and Greek traditions, there's a pattern of tracing ethnic groups back to a pivotal figure related to a flood narrative. In the Bible, it's Noah. In Greek tradition, it's Deucalion, the Greek flood hero. Both are said to have 3 sons, leading to a large portion of their respective world's nations and tribes. Greek writings from around the 6th century BCE, like those of logographers Hecataeus of Miletus and Acusilus of Argos, showcase these genealogies. They typically start with a flood narrative, often mentioning Deucalion, and then detail the origin of the Greeks and other nations. Although our understanding of the full early Greek flood narratives is limited due to fragmentary sources, the concept of a deluge and the ancestry that follows is firmly established in both traditions. The details and focuses may differ, but both ancient cultures sought to understand and categorize their worlds through a lens of lineage and pivotal ancestral figures. Greek genealogies, like that of Acusilus of Argos, often begin with significant events such as floods. Furthermore, in Greek tales, Deucalion survives a flood, landing on Mount Parnassus after making a sacrifice to Zeus. He and his partner, Pyrrha, throw stones that morph into people, symbolizing repopulation. By the 5th century BCE, Deucalion's story and his connection to prominent Greek figures were well established. Unlike the Mesopotamian flood tales, both Greek and biblical stories focus on descendants post-flood. An interesting divergence is the biblical account of Noah planting the first vineyard after the flood, a narrative absent in Mesopotamian versions. This story appears to be uniquely intertwined in both Greek and biblical narratives, suggesting a shared cultural emphasis on wine and civilization. In essence, Both biblical and Greek accounts merge flood stories with the discovery of wine. They outline the establishment of civilizations post-flood, connecting the event with the planting of the first vineyard or the advent of wine. In summary of the article by Guy Darshan, Greek and biblical post-flood stories often share structural and thematic similarities, emphasizing genealogies that trace back to the flood's main hero and his descendants. While it's unclear if Greek writers were familiar with the Hebrew Bible or vice versa, according to Guy Darshan, their flood narratives seem to have evolved in parallel. Both narratives draw from Mesopotamian sources, but also introduce distinctive elements, weaving traditions that blend regional content into older genealogical structures. Both Greek and Israelite traditions highlight genealogies that present the flood's protagonist as the origin of humanity, marking civilization's dawn. The detailed development of these genealogies aim to define the identity of nations or ethnic groups, a prevalent trend in Eastern Mediterranean during the early 1st millennium BCE. Overall, while the flood story's roots lie in Mesopotamia, unique elements are exclusive to the Hebrew Bible and Greek writings. Both traditions embed these tales within genealogical lists that detail early human history and the origins of various nations. These accounts offer a rich picture of ancient narratives and help shed light on the beginnings of humanity and civilization. Inspired by the Greeks. Now that we see the Greeks were the head honchos doing these kind of genealogies, and that the biblical accounts look very similar, we will now turn to Philip Wajdenbaum's work, Argonauts of the Desert, to take a look into the Greek antecedents to the Noah story.
When Noah awoke from his wine and knew what his youngest son had done to him, he said, "Cursed be Canaan, lowest of slaves shall he be to his brothers." He also said, "Blessed by the Lord my God be Shem, and let Canaan be his slave. May God make space for Japheth, and let him live in the tents of Shem, and let Canaan be his slave." Genesis 9:24-27.
Philip Wajdenbaum believes that the prophecy about Japheth, considered the forefather of the Greeks, mirrors the Greeks' arrival in the Near East during the Hellenistic period. Additionally, this tale shares striking parallels with the story from Hesiod's Theogony. In it, Ouranos, the sky god, and Gaia, the earth goddess, were close, but Ouranos wouldn't let their offspring be born. To relieve her pain, Gaia tasked her youngest son, Kronos, to confront Ouranos. Armed with a special sickle from his mother, Kronos cut off Ouranos' genitals and threw them into the sea. From the ensuing foam, the goddess Aphrodite emerged.
But afterwards she lay with heaven and bare deep swirling Oceanus, Cus and Creus, and Hyperion and Lapetus, Thea and Rhea, Themis and Mimosine, and the gold-crowned Phoebe and the lovely Tethys. After them was born Kronos, the wily, youngest and most terrible of her children, and he hated his lusty sire. Hesiod Theogony 130-40. And heaven came, bringing on night and longing for love, and he lay about earth, spreading himself full upon her. Then the sun from his ambush stretched forth his left hand, and in his right took the great long sickle with jagged teeth, and swiftly lopped off his own father's members and cast them away to fall behind. Hesiod Theogony 175-80. But these sons whom he begot himself, great heaven used to call Titans, strainers, in reproach. For he said that they strained and did presumptuously a fearful deed, that vengeance for it would come afterwards. Hesiod Theogony 207-10.
Plato believed that certain stories, like the one of Kronos castrating his father, were too scandalous for the general public and should only be shared with a select group. The biblical version seems to be an adaptation of this tale, where Kronos' act is replaced by Ham merely seeing his father naked. Interestingly, some Jewish interpretations suggest Ham actually castrated his father. Check out Midrash, Rabbah, and Rashi. The biblical story of Adam and Eve has parallels with Plato's concept of androgyny. Some scholars believe the biblical narrative borrows from Hesiod's myths, but is reimagined to fit Plato's ideals from the Republic. In this retelling, the figures are not gods, but long-lived humans, bridging the gap between gods and men. A key element of this adaptation is the naming of Japheth, which closely resembles the titan Lapidos from Greek mythology. Both narratives involve a youngest son committing an offensive act against his father and include a brother named Japheth. The use of the name Japheth seems intentional, possibly hinting at influence of Greek culture. The Sibylline oracles from the Roman period oddly mix the biblical and Greek versions of Japheth. This document suggests that the Greek gods were actually legendary humans. This humanizing approach to gods can be traced back to the philosopher Euhemerus, who presented a more logical version of Greek myths. Similarly, the Bible often presents humans in roles typically reserved for gods in Greek mythology. This shift from myth to a more human-centered narrative is evident in the Bible, and is further highlighted by the Sibylline oracles. The method of euhemerism, or grounding myth in reality, has been used beyond ancient times. In fact, modern efforts to understand the Bible, like the documentary hypothesis, can be seen as a rational approach to interpreting divine inspiration. Wajdenbaum thumbprints in the name. Several names in Greek and biblical literature are strikingly similar. A prime example is the character Japheth in the Bible, Noah's son. His name is similar to the Greek titan Japheth, or Japetos, prominently featured in Hesiod's Theogony. Scholars have long recognized this similarity, suggesting that Hesiod might have been influenced by Semitic traditions. In biblical accounts, Japheth is Noah's son, yet in Greek narratives like Pindar's 9th Olympian Ode, Japheth is the father of Prometheus and Epimetheus, who are equated with the biblical figures of Noah and his wife, or the Mesopotamian character Utnapishtim. It seems the biblical author knew of the Mesopotamian flood story, evident from details like Noah using birds to find land, similar to the Epic of Gilgamesh, Tablet 11. But the presence of the name Japheth also indicates the writer's familiarity with the Greek version. For instance, in the Bible, Japheth is known as the father of Ion, an ancestor of the Greeks. Interestingly, in Greek accounts, Ion is related to Deucalion and by extension, Japheth, and is seen as the forefather of the Ionian Greeks. The Bible's version simplifies the Greek genealogy, making Japheth directly related to Ion. This suggests the biblical author not only knew about the Greeks, but was also well versed in their mythical family trees. This pattern of modifying and shifting characters in genealogical scales isn't unique to Japheth. For example, the biblical figure Cain seems to be derived from the Greek Canis, related to Ixion, the first murderer in humanity according to Greek sources. Another instance is the similarity between the name from the Bible and the Pamphylian from Plato's works. These name resemblance, or fingerprints as some may call them, act as clues pointing back to the original sources. For someone familiar with both Greek and biblical narratives, these hints can be enlightening. It's as if Greek classical writings serve as foundational text for the Bible, which creatively builds upon them. By leaving similar names and reshuffling genealogies, the Bible seems to be paying homage to its inspirations. This isn't a mere copy, but rather an intricate reimagining that subtle nods to its origins. This is affirmed by Bruce Loudon in an article Lapidus and Japheth, Hesiod's Theogony, 1 Iliad 15, 187-93, and Genesis 9-1, which is linked in the description of this video along with other sources. Quote,
Genesis, as it adapts the deluge from Mesopotamian sources, for the sequel transforms Hesiod's account of Cronos' castration of Ouranos, and the unspecified wrongdoing of his brother Lepidus, mixing it with the type of myth depicted in Iliad 15, where three brothers draw lots to determine their portions. This results in Genesis 9 through 10's mysterious depiction of Ham seeing the genitals of the drunk Noah, who when awoke curses not Ham, but his son Canaan, while bestowing blessings on his two other sons, Shem and Japheth, father of Javan, Greek ion. Parallel wordplay in the Theogony 16 and Genesis affirm the link.
Dionysius, the wine god. Dionysius, the Greek god of wine and excess, got the virgin Aura drunk, raped her, and married her before she sobered up. The god of wine and ecstasy, Dionysius, was madly in love with Aura, a virgin Titan goddess who liked to hunt. Desperate for her love, Dionysius used his godly power to create a wine fountain nearby Aura to slake her thirst while hunting. After gulping a lot of the wine, Aura got drunk. Then Dionysius took advantage of her while she was unconscious. But that's not all. Other gods saw the union and convinced Dionysius to marry her. So they threw a wedding for the god and unconscious bride. Upon waking, Aura was furious but helpless against the god. So she could only lament her lost virginity and the fact that she was pregnant with twins. Aura devoured the firstborn of the twins out of anger, while the secondborn was rescued by the gods. It really shouldn't come as a shock that Dionysius, the god of wine from the Greek world, would have something to do with the vineyard in Noah's story or the drunkenness of Lot with his daughters. Genesis through Kings does a really good job of demythologizing the Greek, Mesopotamian, Egyptian, Canaanite, Phoenician, and other myths. Plato did the same with his own Greek mythologies, without the risk of being accused of the same atheistic heresies as Socrates, which was put to death or took his own life. Plato played with these mythological characters, but ultimately believed in one god. And as this series unravels, you'll see much more revealed from the Bible about Plato's thumbprints. I mean, it's no coincidence that Philo of Alexandria, Josephus, Eusebius, and others are making apologetics, trying to suggest Plato borrowed from the much older Moses and his laws. We will dispel this myth, bringing sober clarity for those drunk on Noah's vineyards. We don't want your nakedness to be seen through nonsensical apologetics. These authors had no choice but to suggest that Plato found inspiration from Moses instead of the accusations that it was the other way by skeptics of their ancient claims. I mean, the fact that people recognized that Plato and the Bible have so much in common that they thought one had to be inspired by the other is an admission we need to further investigate. So just mentioning Dionysius with Aura, she has sexual relationships with Dionysius, she wakes up, there's a marriage even, she's pregnant, the whole nine. This looks very similar to kind of a mixture between Lot and Noah in a way. Noah finds out after waking up what his son did to him in his unconscious state. This is exactly what happens to Aura. So you really wonder about the biblical author and how clever they were in not only knowing the myth of Deucalion in the Greek world, but also seeing how this plays into a Dionysian story. There could be more going on than one thing, especially if this author is as well read as I think and many of these scholars think these biblical authors probably were on the Greek myths. The Bible owes Plato. Conclusion. In today's scholarly exploration, we've delved into the intricate nuances of the Genesis narrative, particularly focusing on the tale of Noah's flood. We discerned the Hellenistic nuances, especially in the peculiar prophecy concerning Japheth's destined residence in Shem's tents, a poignant allusion to the Greeks and the Jews' cultural amalgamation. This offers a compelling argument for the ex eventu nature of the Genesis account, suggesting its composition in the retrospective light of the Hellenistic era. Furthermore, our study unearthed striking parallels between the audacious castration of Ouranos by Kronos in Greek lore and the ambitious incident between Ham and Noah. Certain Jewish Midrashic traditions intimate at a similar audacious act, rendering this parallelism more pronounced. While the Mesopotamian mythological framework does offer some foundational constructs, particularly in our initial phases of the Origins of the Bible series, the nuances and details of Genesis find clearer resonance with Greek theogonies. Notably, both traditions narrate the transgressions of a youngest son against his father and prominently feature a character named Japheth. Both Mesopotamian myths and Greek myths play a role. If you're only looking at one and not recognizing the Greek one as well, then you're not going to see what we're saying. Our forthcoming documentaries promise to shed more light on the intriguing possibility that the biblical authors might have been inspired by Plato's philosophical musings, contrary to the commonly held apologetic perspective. We aim to traverse the extensive labyrinth of biblical narratives and their corresponding global mythological counterparts. This endeavor seeks to present the hypothesis that not just the initial chapters of Genesis, but the entirety of Israel's narrative history may have been masterfully crafted, possibly during the Hellenistic epoch, if not slightly earlier during the Persian period. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a deep dive series on the origins of the Bible. Where do these stories come from? I'm not suggesting that they're just ripping off content without any thinking involved or that they have this evil intent of plagiarism. No, I can't read the motives of several authors that are writing this material. I asked the question myself, did they intend for their readers to convince them that this was true by backdating these legends, these myths and stories, trying to place them as far back into antiquity, just like Plato in his little rule books suggested? See, the upcoming video I want to do next is actually going to show you that the Bible is indebted to Plato. See, in antiquity, you had people like Josephus, Philo of Alexandria, Eusebius, and all sorts of Christian apologists and such that suggested that Plato may have copied from Moses. Pause. Why would anyone think that Plato copied Moses? There was enough in common between what Plato taught and what is found in the Hebrew scriptures that it made people have to recognize something is going on. There's too much in common for it to be coincidence. So the Christians, and anybody who read the ancient literature at the time, said, well, Moses is really, really old according to the texts of the Bible when this was written. See, if I wrote a book and said, hey, this guy named Deucalion lived 7,000 years ago, and here's some of the laws he taught, and you had no way to historiographically or archaeologically prove that Deucalion didn't exist 7,000 years ago and made these laws up, and you had a guy 500 years ago, well, I would just say my text says he's 7,000 years old, and your guy's only 500. Your guy had to copy my guy. That's why there's commonalities. Especially if you go back a few centuries before I make these claims that this literature's on the scene. So you're going to find a deep dive again on why Plato was used by the biblical authors. And I'm going to do the best I can, because while it isn't absolute or certain, it is a bit speculative to try and make these conclusions. You're going to want to follow along. I could use your help in this endeavor with your likes, your comments. Let's make the YouTube world pay attention. And those who take these stories literally, historically true, they need to watch these videos so they can understand from someone who actually loves the Bible but doesn't believe it. Someone who loves this literature, ancient history, myth, lore, legend, the whole nine. So we can learn together. I do a lot of research as I dive into every single one of these videos. I'm trying to give you something different, something that you won't just hear going to a typical professor at a university today. I want to go and test the cutting edge, minimalist, Hellenistic angle that I think the future is going to point to in terms of where our evidence is heading. There's still a real strong trend in academia on ideas that are kind of, in my opinion, dated. And with each dying generation, as Paula Fredrickson once said, where there's death, there's hope. Each dying generation of scholars, a new idea can spawn without being held back by the previous generation of academics. And I'm hoping to be talking to an audience today, but I know that a growing audience will be there in the future. What did you think about Noah and his drunkenness with Ham castrating him, and that Jewish rabbis themselves thought there was some type of homosexuality going on and some castration model that makes sense? Look at what happened to Ouranos, Uranus with Kronos. Quite interesting. I think it's interesting also to point out how Kronos, when he castrated Uranus or Ouranos, he stopped him from producing seed, which also inevitably kept him from eating more of his children. So there might be some remnant, as it was euhemerized, of the previous myth, which this is why scholars, rabbis, and such were scratching their head throughout history, and people are still trying to figure out, why did he curse his grandson and not just Ham? You always hear it as the curse of Ham. Why not the curse of Canaan? We always call it the curse of Ham. So I love diving into that. I also wanted to briefly highlight Dionysius just because I think that the getting drunk idea, the wine in the vineyard, plays such a significant role with the Greek world. I also loved the connections. I discovered these connections as I was digging in deeper between Lot and Noah and seeing a fire myth catastrophe and a water myth catastrophe, and both survived. Both were drunk. One knew what his son did. One didn't know what his daughters did. And I wanted to point out the absurdity of that. You just said yesterday you're two virgins to the strangers that were trying to hump the angels. They could have them. And then now they're pregnant out of nowhere? Did Lot not know that he did these things? Or, what in the world's going on? There's all sorts of fun, mushy-gushy stuff, but on a literal basis, it does not work out. It doesn't make sense. So I hope that you will help continue to help us by liking, commenting, sharing this out on social media. It helps a lot. If you're able to help out more, because it takes so much time and energy to produce these high-level edits, I could really use your help. I could really use your help by joining the Patreon, which makes you part of the family, joining the YouTube membership program, which helps me as well. You can also give like a one-time super thanks to anyone who does that. I try to recognize you and take the time to answer any question you might have in the comment section. PayPal, I have options that can help support us financially with what we're doing here, but sharing it and all those options are free, and I hope that you can do that because I want to continue this series. Next up, Plato and the authors of the Bible, which one came first and who copied who. And then later, I'm going to dive into several myths. I want to focus on individual characters. I want to give you the myths that have been well known and established amongst academics, and then also the Greek connections that very few scholars have drawn out that I think probably make the most sense in terms of what's happening in the Bible. Moses will get covered, various figures in depth. So help us continue this work. And thank you so much. We invite you to further engage with our content. Please like, comment, and most importantly, subscribe. You can also support us by joining the Patreon, early access, and become part of the family. Your participation enriches this scholarly discourse. And as we always emphasize, remember, we are Mythvision.